Today, many schools, restaurants, and food programs follow strict food safety rules that limit how leftovers can be reused. But during the Great Depression, there were no rules, no safety warnings, and no such thing as waste. Families turned scraps into survival. And meals that would seem surprisingly simple to many modern families were simply everyday dinner. Children often ate foods prepared under conditions that would not meet many modern food safety standards, yet it kept entire households alive through brutal winters. This was an era of practical survival, cooking simple, forgotten, and strangely genius. And one of these meals became so powerful, it was carried in protest all the way to the White House. Act 1. The meals that kept winter away. 1. Beans and cornbread. Beans were not actually the cheapest thing in Depression kitchens. Some families ate this meal 6 days a week because it was warm, filling, and dependable. A pot of beans simmering all day on the stove could be stretched with a ham bone, a little onion, and whatever seasoning was left in the cupboard. In many homes, cornbread came out of a cast iron skillet hot enough to crack when it was cut, with steam rising from the beans beneath it. Nobody talked about nutrition charts or amino acids. They only knew one thing: the children went to bed full, and in hard times, that was a victory all by itself. 2. Cabbage and noodles. Cabbage was the king of thrift because it stayed cheap, kept well in cold weather, and could feed a whole table with almost nothing added. Tossed with noodles and a spoonful of bacon grease, it became the kind of meal immigrant households knew how to make from memory, not from recipes. It was humble, but it had a real home-cooked smell to it, the kind that filled a kitchen before anyone even sat down. In winter, that mattered. A meal did not have to look rich to feel generous, and cabbage proved that over and over again. 3. Bread and gravy. Gravy still required ingredients, and some families had only potatoes. This is the moment where poverty food stops sounding like a recipe and starts sounding like a memory. Bread soaked in gravy could turn the driest, oldest loaf into something soft and comforting, almost like a rescue. The smell alone could make a cold kitchen feel warmer. That line, "Gravy fills the cracks," says everything about why people loved it. It reached into the rough edges of a hard day and made them manageable. A plate like this was not fancy, but it was kind. And in a winter when kindness was scarce, that counted for a lot more than presentation ever could. 4. Potato soup. Another meal from rice and beans could feed people even longer. Potato soup was the kind of meal that appeared in church kitchens, soup lines, and family pots when nothing else seemed possible. Steam rising from the bowl gave the illusion of abundance, even when the ingredients were barely enough to matter: potatoes, water, maybe a little milk if there was any, and a touch of onion could become dinner for everyone. That is why this dish survived in memory so long. It tasted like people trying their best. In the Depression, a bowl of soup was not just food. It was proof that somebody still cared whether you made it through the night. 5. Rice and beans. Rice and beans could last for months when stored properly. Together they made a complete, steady meal that could be stretched for days, and in a time of rising prices, that kind of efficiency felt like magic. Families learned how to season it in tiny ways: 1 onion, a little fat, maybe a pinch of pepper so it did not feel like surrender. It felt like skill. That is part of why this combination survived long after the Depression ended. It was cheap, yes, but it was also smart. And when money disappeared, smart was what kept dinner on the table. But survival was not only about stretching food. Sometimes it meant transforming leftovers into meals people actually looked forward to eating. Act 2. When leftovers became dinner. 6. Potato pancakes. Potato pancakes turned something plain into something people were happy to eat again. Leftover mashed potatoes, little flour, maybe an egg if the kitchen was lucky, and suddenly there was a skillet full of crisp edges and a soft center. The sound of them sizzling in the pan was enough to bring people into the kitchen before supper was even ready. For many families, this was how they survived winter boredom too, not just hunger. A leftover became a fresh meal, and that small transformation mattered. It told everyone at the table that nothing had to be wasted, not even the day before. 7. American goulash. Sometimes meat disappeared completely. American goulash had a special kind of genius in it. A little pasta, a little tomato, maybe 1 pound of meat stretched until it seemed like enough for a crowd, and suddenly dinner could feed a surprisingly large family without anyone feeling cheated. It was the kind of dish that rewarded patience and punished waste. Everything went into one pot, which meant fewer dishes and less fuel, two things every poor family understood as blessings. The tomato gave it body, the meat gave it flavor, and the noodles made it feel bigger than it really was. That was depression cooking at its best, making a little look like a lot. 8. Macaroni and tomatoes. Macaroni and tomatoes was cheap, shelf-stable, and forgiving, which made it exactly the kind of meal families depended on when winter dragged on. The canned tomatoes brought brightness to the dish, a sharp red color that almost looked cheerful against the pale noodles. It also gave people something important, a little vitamin C when fresh produce was scarce. In a period when many meals felt brown, beige or grey, this one had life in it. It did not pretend to be rich. It simply showed up and did its job, which is why so many households kept making it long after the Depression ended. 9. Cabbage rolls. Cabbage rolls made poverty look almost elegant. The same cabbage that could be boiled and tossed with noodles was now wrapped around rice or scraps of meat and served in a way that felt thoughtful, even careful. That mattered because dignity mattered. When food was scarce, how it looked on the plate could lift a family's mood more than the ingredients themselves. These rolls stretched what little there was, while still looking like someone had tried to make supper feel special. In hard times, effort was its own kind of luxury. Cabbage rolls proved that a poor meal did not have to feel cheap. 10. Hoover stew. This was the meal that carried anger all the way to the White House. Hoover stew became a symbol of how difficult life had become for many American families. It was the kind of simple stew that held together whatever was available: macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs, and whatever inexpensive ingredients could be stretched a little farther if luck showed up. But the real story was bigger than the bowl. Protesters carried the name of this meal into public view because it represented frustration, hunger, and the feeling that ordinary families were being left behind. Few dishes in American history speak so loudly without saying much at all. That is why Hoover stew stands out. It was food, but it was also protest. Many of these meals survived long after the Depression ended. What was the one dish your mother or grandmother made from almost nothing? Act 3, the meals people still argue about. 11. Salmon patties. Salmon patties were a clever answer to scarcity because canned fish could sit on the shelf until needed, and a few flakes of salmon could be turned into enough patties for dinner. Eggs, crumbs, onion, and a hot skillet gave them shape, while the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed soft. For some families, this was a practical miracle. For others, it was a memory they never wanted to repeat. But that is exactly why it matters in a Depression story. It shows how households learned to make ordinary shelf food feel like supper. It was thrift with a frying pan, and it fed people when fresh meat was out of reach. 12. Liver and onions. No food in this list divides people faster than liver and onions. Some loved it. Some hated it. There was no middle ground. That alone makes it powerful, because Depression food often had to be remembered through strong opinions. Liver was cheap, filling, and packed with iron, which meant it earned a place in kitchens that had to count every penny. The onions softened the edge of the flavor, the pan drippings built the gravy, and the whole plate turned into a lesson in necessity. For some families, it was just another Tuesday. For others, it was a meal they never forgot for all the wrong reasons. Either way, nobody ignored it. "13. Milk toast. Milk toast sounds almost too plain to matter, and that is exactly why it lands so hard. Warm milk poured over toasted bread could become the gentlest thing in a cold house, especially for children or sick family members. It was the kind of meal a mother made when she had very little left, but still wanted to give something tender. There is no drama in milk toast, no big flavors to brag about later, only comfort. In a winter without enough heat, that warmth meant everything. It was breakfast, supper, and reassurance all at once. Some recipes fill a stomach. This one filled a moment with safety, and that is why people remember it. 14. Chili beans. Chili beans were both food and fuel in the emotional sense. A pot of beans seasoned with chili could warm the kitchen, stretch across several meals, and give tired people something with enough flavor to feel alive. In houses where the stove doubled as the heart of the home, this mattered even more because everyone gathered around the heat as much as the food. Beans were cheap, filling, and practical, but chili gave them a little fire. That small spark could change the mood of an entire evening. In a winter of cold rooms and tighter budgets, chili beans did more than feed people. They reminded them that warmth could still be made. 15. Mulligan stew. Mulligan stew belongs to places where people had to share what little they had. Railroad camps, work camps, and crowded households all knew the same lesson. One person's scraps could become everyone's supper if enough broth, patience, and goodwill were added. This was not a recipe so much as a method of survival. Anything useful could go in, and nothing edible should be thrown away. That made the stew feel human in a way fancier meals never could. It turned hardship into a shared event instead of a private burden. The result was not perfection, it was fellowship. And in the Depression, fellowship could be the ingredient that mattered most. People shared what little they had to survive. But the meals that came next were built on an even stricter rule: waste absolutely nothing. Act 4, nothing wasted. 16. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was old food repurposed for hard times, and that gave it a kind of timeless strength. Cooked slowly until thick, then served plain, fried, or topped with whatever the kitchen could spare, it was one of those dishes that asked very little and gave a lot back. It filled plates, stretched budgets, and settled stomachs. There was nothing glamorous about it, but glamour was never the point. The point was survival without complaint. In many homes, mush was the kind of meal that made people feel connected to older generations who had also known scarcity. That continuity gave the food an unexpected dignity. It was simple, but it was not small. "17. Cabbage stew. Cabbage stew was the kind of meal that could feed a crowd from one huge pot, which is why soup kitchens and community tables leaned on it so heavily. Cabbage softened beautifully when simmered long enough, and with potatoes, broth, or a few scraps of meat, it became a meal that felt bigger than the sum of its parts. The smell alone could pull people toward the table. In that way, cabbage stew was more than efficiency. It was comfort made public. It showed up when people needed to feel fed, not just counted. And in a decade when every meal had to justify itself, that mattered more than most people today can imagine. 18. Dumplings in broth. Dumplings in broth are the kind of meal that proves how far flour, water, and a little broth can go when people refuse to give up. The dumplings puffed up as they cooked, turning thin liquid into something filling and soft. It was the sort of food that appeared when groceries were low and creativity had to take over. Grandmothers, mothers, and older sisters knew how to make dough from almost nothing and stretch the meal one more time. That is why this dish belongs in the story. It is less about taste than technique, less about luxury than knowledge. In the Depression, knowing how to make dumplings was almost the same as knowing how to survive. "19. Soup beans. Soup beans were especially important in Appalachian kitchens, where dried beans, long cooking, and honest thrift were part of everyday life. A pot could simmer for hours, filling the house with a smell that promised supper long before the beans were done. Served with cornbread, onions, or pickled vegetables, they became more than just cheap food. They became a regional habit, a marker of endurance, and a reminder that people in the mountains knew how to make a little go a long way. This was food shaped by land, weather, and history. It did not ask for attention. It simply kept showing up, year after year, when families needed it most. "20. Hash from leftovers. Hash from leftovers is the clearest expression of depression thinking there is. If something remained from yesterday, it did not get thrown out. It got chopped, fried, mixed, and made useful again. Potatoes, meat scraps, vegetables, and bits of bread could all become a new meal when a skillet and determination were involved. That is why this dish feels like the end of the story and the beginning of the next one at the same time. It represents every lesson families learned in hard times: save everything, waste nothing, respect every scrap. A plate of hash was never just food. It was a philosophy. Every penny mattered, every bite mattered, and every meal had to prove it deserved to exist. These meals were not famous because they tasted extraordinary. They mattered because they solved impossible problems. A few potatoes, half an onion, a handful of beans. Somehow, that was enough. Enough to carry families through another winter. Enough to create memories people still talk about nearly a century later. And maybe that is the real mystery, how something so small could mean so much, because somewhere in another kitchen, another winter, another family was staring at the same tiny pile of food, trying to figure out how to make it last until next week.